Welcome to the Replication Conversations on behalf of the Journal of Supply Chain Management, and a special welcome to Professor Christine Harland of the Politecnico di Milano. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much, Finn.
Welcome. My name is Finn Wynstra, and I'm very happy to have Christine here to join us for another conversation on replication studies. Before this interview, we agreed on the study that you would be interested to see replicated in future research. And that is a study published in the Journal of Supply Chain Management in 2019, entitled Implementing Government Policy in Supply Chains, an international co-production study of public procurement, co-authored with Jan Telgen, Guy Callender, Rick Grimm, and Andrea Patrucco. So could you maybe say a few words about what are the main questions, the findings of this study?
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, very much to the Journal of Supply Chain Management for the initiative. I think these conversations that I've seen so far have been very interesting. So main questions that this paper is focused on, it's really motivated by some fundamentals. First is that governments around the world spend enormous amounts of money with supply markets. I think that's the main, it falls within operations and supply chain management. Secondly, small businesses we know are very important economically, in society, for innovation, it's well shown. So small businesses are important. We know that governments are trying, therefore, to keep small business sectors to keep thriving and to engage them, therefore, in this enormous amount of spending that they make with supply markets. So how can we get small businesses to benefit from public procurement contracting? And we know that governments are trying to do this, but we know that they're not doing it very well. So the questions that we looked at in this paper, we wanted to see how governments and public procurement were trying to engage them, what type of mechanisms they're using, are there any patterns we can see internationally, how they use different mechanisms. And also we wanted to do a study both two parties. We wanted to ask governments their perception of what they were doing to engage small businesses, and the small business community, their perception of what governments were doing, and see whether or not they had any agreement. So those are the main questions. And so in terms of then the findings, for what broad findings, we found a large range of mechanisms used internationally. So this is an international study in multiple countries, and different clusters and mechanisms. And we found quite significant gaps in perceptions about what the small business community found was useful the governments were doing, and what governments thought that they were doing that was really useful.
Yeah. Okay. The title already mentioned an international co-production study, which is an interesting term. So could you tell a little bit more about the data collection and analysis methods that were used for this study?
Yeah, this is part of the International Research Study of Public Procurement. And it's a network of about 55 countries involved. It involves as many senior public procurement practitioners as we can find to want to work with us. And this has been built since 2003. So we've got quite a number now of senior people involved. And we're interested in them really helping us to see what are the interesting research questions, what do they need to know, and to help us co-design research, but then importantly, help us to do the research, because they can access all of the information and resources that we need in their particular countries. So the co-production part in this particular study, this paper focuses on 13 co-produced case studies where we co-designed the questions and the template for the research for how we wanted them to find out in their countries what was happening about how governments were trying to engage with small businesses and also to engage their small business associations in the research. So the co-production is a balancing them engaging in their countries and doing the work, but also then us helping to design and to analyze the work. I would add that in each country, we get the most senior academics we can engage as part of the team. So it's not practitioners on their own trying to do research. So, but it's multi-stage. We've repeated this methodology for several studies now. We co-designed a template for the case studies, and during the production of the case studies over about 6 months, we help them. So there's constant dialogue. When they produce their case studies, we bring all the parties together. So in this case, it's the public procurement people and small business representatives into a workshop with the academic team. And this we managed to get the most senior person who did government procurement for Norway, the man who shops for a country. We got the chief executive of the National Institute of Government Procurement in the US. So it's that sort of level to be able to get the conversation in the workshop that we then, during the workshop, we all collectively share all of the cases and analyze the cases in the workshop. And then after the workshop, really start to do a lot of analysis as an academic team, going back and forth to the people who created the cases where we don't understand. Yeah. It takes years, actually. So,
I can imagine. Yeah. Very impressive, but very time-consuming process.
Yeah, and it's also very resource-intensive. There are currently 9 leading academics as organisers on the study, and these are across 6 countries.
Yeah.
But to say the network of countries is 55 countries.
Yeah. Yeah, and impressive the range of countries as well. I don't think we have many studies that include also cases from Mongolia and Uganda, for instance. So that's really impressive. So moving to the topic specifically of replication, are there particular reasons why you think it would be useful or interesting to replicate this particular study?
Firstly, I'm passionate about the operators and supply chain management community doing more research outside private sector supply chains and supply relationships, because the impact of governments and their spending in supply markets is enormous. You know, we're talking about in France, look at the OECD figures that tell you, you know, it's like 57% of GDP in France is impacted by government spending in supply markets. Similar percentages in European countries. So firstly, it's the need for us to understand the impact, the scale of how we could improve supply chain management through researching in this area. So there's the motivation. There's also, I did become very interested in small businesses. I think they've been less represented in research. It hasn't, a lot of the big studies have been of large private sector organizations, dominantly manufacturers. So there's sort of the motivation side. But I'd be particularly interested in replicating here the methods used. And co-production doesn't have to be on the scale that we're doing here. But for me, the engaging practitioners in the design, firstly, in what questions do we as a community need to address? What are the important topics for research? But also engaging them to help us to access their resources and be a part of the research. So we are constantly reminded of what the important question is, what the issues are, and that it's going to have impact. So I guess one of my main drivers for replication is that we do more studies that have got impact.
Yeah. So really studying this particular phenomenon more broadly in the public sector, and particularly the role of SMEs, but also replicating the method, perhaps also for totally different research questions. Indeed, yeah. If you look at this particular study and the research questions on these mechanisms, is there other ways that you would recommend in terms of replicating empirical studies using the same research questions? Or
yeah, sure. There's a lot of knowledge already out there relating to these individual mechanisms. So in the paper, we've got a table that shows all the different studies that have looked at particular mechanisms. So bringing together in this study, we've now got a set of all of these mechanisms. I think it'd be really interesting to use those mechanisms and to try to do a broader survey internationally. I think we could see that type of empirical study to check, because this was only 13 case studies. Yeah. So if we could have a large scale empirical survey that then looks at the presence of these mechanisms, the clusters of how these mechanisms are used, and also attempts to replicate the two-party perception study. I think that's interesting. I like the idea of replicating more the behavioral question, the third research question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very good. So any final words of advice or recommendations to fellow scholars that would like to continue on this topic or this method more broadly, Christine?
Well, I think one of the other things that is very interesting is using theories that are not in our normal comfort zone in operations and supply chain management. And we found policy feedback theory in this study to be a very interesting theory. It's called a theory. We could discuss whether it is a theory, but basically it's actually showing that we can use resource capability stimulating mechanisms to try to implement policy, but we could also use more informational and behavioral mechanisms to try to engage. So I think I'd be interested in seeing this theory used more, because in this particular context, the small businesses responded more to the resource-based capability incentives. They wanted the money. Yeah. They didn't value the websites and the online support as much. They said, we just need investment, we need financial incentives. But in other contexts, then I think it'd be interesting to see the balance of how we get the informational side of mechanisms to balance with those resource capability mechanisms. So I think policy feedback theory for me is also something that we could see used more in our field.
Yeah, okay, well, that's I think a very nice recommendation to close off on. So thanks very much again for joining these replication conversations, Christine. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim.